Alright guys, here we are with another video on this beautiful 2005 Honda Pilot. It's really nice, it's really low mileage. And unlike the Buick Lucernes, it actually starts and runs well enough for me to drive. This is my personal color. So today we're going to be looking at some oxygen sensors and showing you about what they do, what kind of data they put out, and how to read that. So let's dive right in here and go find those oxygen sensors. Let's take a look at the wiring diagram. So this is the upstream sensor, and immediately over here you can see the heater. So you have green and white, which is heater ground, and blue and white, which is heater power. So other than that, these are your two cells here, okay? So this red and white wire is your VECT, green and red wire is the IP, which is the actual amperage pump, or the ion pump, and that reads amperage. And then red and blue is the voltage signal coming into that.
So now we have the downstream sensor highlighted, and we're going to look at the wiring diagram for it. So this white wire right here, that's going to be your sensor voltage. The green and yellow wire, that's going to be your sensor ground. The blue and white wire, that's going to be your heater power. And the green and red, that'll be the heater ground.
All right, here on the Honda Pilot, we're going to look at the location of the oxygen sensors. So, for starters, the engine is mounted transverse, with the front of the engine being over here and the transmission over here. But this is the front of the vehicle, and that is the rear side of the vehicle. The rear side is bank 1, and the front side is bank 2. So, you can see the catalytic converters come right off the exhaust manifolds, and your oxygen sensor is right there below the valve cover, and its connector is right here on the back of the bank. On the back of the engine on bank 1, you can see it's the same. You have your oxygen sensor. It's kind of hard to see right below that coil. That is your bank 1 upstream oxygen sensor, and its pigtail is over there. We have to get underneath the vehicle to see the downstream oxygen sensors, but they are on the bottom of those catalytic converters that come off the manifold. So this is the front of the vehicle. So this is bank 2, sensor 2. And then if you look right there, right in the middle of your screen, there is bank 1, sensor 2. It's also worth noting that on this car, the upstream oxygen sensors 1 on both banks are 5 wires, so they are ion pumping sensors, and the lower sensors, the downstream sensor, but the sensor number 2, those are traditional zirconia oxygen sensors. Alright, so here let's talk a little bit about how an ion pumping sensor works. So on this car, this is going to be the 2 upstream sensors. So here you have the exhaust stream, this is your exhaust gas, and then you have a little diffusion passage here, which allows exhaust gas into this diffusion cell. Now down here you have a sealed reference cell, which is sealed with atmospheric air. So this nerd cell here is going to measure, this works like a traditional oxygen sensor, a traditional zirconia oxygen sensor. So this is going to measure difference in oxygen between the diffusion cell and the reference cell. And so the PCM control of this is trying to keep this nerd cell at exactly 450 millivolts, which is that 0.5 volt voltage that we're talking about to be perfectly stoichiometric. So over here you have a pumping cell, and what this does is it will pump oxygen into or out of this diffusion cell, or this diffusion passage. I should say these are kind of just passages or cavities. They're not really cells. These are the cells. But it pumps oxygen into or out of here to try to get this diffusion cell to be perfectly stoichiometric. So the amount of current, basically, that it takes to pump oxygen, the amount of current it spends pumping oxygen into or out of the diffusion cell to keep this nerd cell down here at 0.45 volts is calculated as your air-fuel ratio. And this is the downstream sensors on these vehicles. This is just a standard zirconia style oxygen sensor. So what this looks like is two electrodes, and it's, monitoring the exhaust, the oxygen content in between these two electrodes in this little passageway here. And the reading you're going to get from that is either 0 volts down here or 1 volt, which is up here. So if your voltage is high, and then in the middle here is perfectly stoichiometric, but this acts like a light switch. So it's either at 1 volt or it's at 0 volts. So you can see here, if it's at low voltage, that 0 volt, that means it's lean. If it's at high voltage, that means it's rich. So here it's rich, here it's lean. What you want to look for in this is the switching back and forth from rich to lean to rich to lean to rich to lean, because it won't sit at perfectly stoichiometric. Alright, so now I'm looking at one of my old oxygen sensors here. This is the one that came out of Bank 1 Sensor 1. I replaced it with a factory one. The part number for that is 24302. This is the box the new one came in. This is the old sensor. Now this had a good heater. I measured the resistance on it with the meter, and it was exactly the same as the old sensor. So if I plug that in here, between the yellow on the pigtail, it's the yellow and the blue wires. On the connector side, it is a blue and white wire and a black and white wire. You can see it has 2.5, 2.4 ohms, which is exactly what the new sensor had. So I knew that this sensor at least had a good heater. That was not the problem with it.
All right, so over here we're connected to the Bank 2 Sensor 1 oxygen sensor, and we're connected to the heater power right now, so connected to ground. You can see it's connected to the heater sensor, and right now it's on because it's reading 12 volts.
Alright, so here I am pinned into the voltage signal out pin of the downstream O2 sensor. I'm not even able to see that yellow shielded wire down there, right below the connector in the middle of the screen. That is to the downstream sensor. And so that's your voltage reading per minute. It's pretty jumpy, so it's kind of hard to read on a multimeter. But if we look at lambda here, you can see that it's right at 0.991 up to 1.1, 1.01 maybe, so right at stoichiometric, which is what we want to see.
All right, so we got the pilot here running, and we have the data here. So we have the Bank 2 sensor, which is the frontmost sensor, and this. So we have the lambda and short-term fuel trim. So, and here you can see the pumping cell. So this is going to show the amperage that it takes for the pumping cell to make sure that the diffusion cell is stoichiometric. And so as I rev the engine, you could see Bank 2 lambda and amperage for the sensor are almost the same. Like they kind of represent each other. As the lambda increases, the amperage is going to increase, and vice versa. And you.
Alright, here we are running. We got the top on, hooked up to the lower oxygen sensor. This is V1S2, so the back bank sensor number 2. So in blue is your heater current, or your, output voltage. So that will vary with air-fuel ratio. Should be hovering right around that 0.45 we see, and a little to the north and south of that. And then I just threw in heater current there as well. You can see the heater is drawing current because it's on.
So here we have our live data for the downstream O2 sensor. And right now it's hovering around 1 lambda, 0.99, which is where you want it to be, because you want the AFR to be at stoichiometric, which is 14.7. And to be able to find the AFR, you do your lambda times your stoichiometric, which is 14.7. And so since it's at 1, then it's like the optimal AFR. And we can also see the heater is on, since this is the standard zirconia oxygen sensor. And then we'll go under the car and check it and check out the sensor.
Alright, so here we got the engine running with the graph, and I'll make sense of this first before we hit the propane. So what you're looking at in the blue is lambda for upstream sensor. We're doing this all on bank 1 to keep it consistent. The orange is the pump voltage, pump amperage for the upstream sensor, the ion pump. And then the purple is the downstream sensor output. So an increase in these levels is going to meet rich. So if you want to give it a little shot of propane. So you can hear the engine lug down, and you can watch the lambda go way up because it's going super rich for a second. You can also see where the downstream sensor caught that rich spike. And the pump amperage goes way up too because it tries to pump a whole lot of oxygen into that little chamber.